Welcome back to Ireland Radar. Today I'm joined by Virgin Media presenter and Irish Examiner columnist Tommy Martin. Tommy, how are you?
Hi James, how are you? I'm very well, thank you.
All good, all good. Yeah, listen, so we were just having you on today. Obviously, seen the article in the Examiner about James Coleman. Really good read if anyone hasn't read it already. And just want to kind of talk a bit about him. Obviously, 79 caps for Ireland, one European Championship campaign in 2016, where he obviously captained us to that victory over Italy and Lille, sent us through to the last 16. Probably should have been two major tournaments really, with Trapp not including him in the 2012 squad. And yeah, obviously a World Cup appearance, I think, is what everyone was kind of hoping for from an Irish perspective, but for Seamus as well, it kind of would have rounded off his Ireland career nicely. Is it safe to say his contribution in an Irish shirt has warranted more major tournament experiences, Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, look, the one with 2012, even at the time, was an odd one. I don't think anybody who was covering it at the time will remember. It was just one of sort of Trapattoni's little strange foibles that he was very cautious about bringing players in, and then maybe it was that Italian mindset that I think Coleman was 20, nearly 24 at the time. That he's in the Italian sort of phrase that makes you a bit of a spring chicken, given they like their defenders to be sort of pushing into their late 30s before they hit their peak. And I like at the time Coleman was he'd sort of broken on the scene and caught people's attention with his sort of attacking forays down the right hand side for Everton. And I don't know if Trapattoni liked his fullbacks crossing the halfway line, so that was kind of unfortunate for him. But obviously, as time went on, he just became one of our absolute mainstays in the as the subsequent managerial teams had. And look, he's just part of the sort of he's just one sort of angle to the sort of sad story of the last decade in terms of not qualifying for major tournaments. He in that I think his contribution as consistent, obviously a consistent performer at a good level in the Premier League. Like most of his time as a first team player starter for Everton, they would have been in and around pushing sort of European places or at least mid-table. They've obviously had, struggles since. And he's obviously been a bit part player for Everton over the last few years. But I think it's just the sort of piece in the aftermath of Prague, and whether, the speculation about whether the Macedonia game was his last, which we don't quite know yet, was just to sort of say that like he's just his overall contribution, what he's done in a pretty dark time for Irish football. He came out a lot of nights. He came out to talk about performances and management that maybe things were not going well. He was always there to front up. He was never an individualist. I even think when Hallgrimsson left him out of the first camp this time, I think it was clear he wasn't happy about it. I think he said it when he came back in the next camp, but you couldn't. I mean, I would imagine around the place he was just absolutely right back in there and not sulking or not. I'm sure he was the best sort of asset for Hallgrimsson in the subsequent camps, as we could see on the field as well. So, I mean, look, overall, yeah, he you'd love to have sent him off, with a World Cup appearance to add to what's been a fantastic contribution to Irish football. But his career is sort of, it's wound around the sort of failures, and he's sort of kept the light shining really in terms of his consistency of performance, consistency of standards through some tough years.
What did you kind of think of the North Macedonia game? Like I thought, like kind of as you referenced there, and as you referenced in the article, like that the image of Seamus at the friendly was like a player that seemed to have like his foot half in and half out of international retirement. Like seeing him with his kids and stuff, he seemed quite emotional during the national anthem. Do you think like maybe he is thinking about retirement, or maybe are we reading the situation wrong?
You'd have to think so. You'd have to think. I mean, you're only looking at the visuals of that a player like if he was sort of the mind that no, I'm I'm playing on here. I'm keeping going another campaign. I see myself going till 2028. Would you do that? Would you necessarily sort of have that sort of that moment with his kids on the pitch against North Macedonia? It could well be that he doesn't quite know himself, and maybe that's literally why and there's a logic to that in that he perhaps that's why he hasn't made an announcement or didn't want to say anything. Maybe he wants to leave it till the summer to see whether his club situation is sorted. Like obviously he's out of contract at Everton. I would be surprised if I mean the discussion there might be Seamus, we want you to stay on the coaching staff side. He might have a different idea. Like he's so wedded to Everton and the institution, like he's just part of the fabric of that club, in terms of any of their sort of, you know, Everton community foundation work. He's front and center. He's Mr. Everton in terms of visiting, you know, people in hospital, kids, any community events that they have. So it's almost, I wondered maybe he'll presumably be making that decision in the next few months or having that decision made for him. And maybe the Ireland thing is just he wants to leave that little bit of time to make up his mind. I mean, look, I know there was a discussion and that, the lads in RTE felt that, look, it would be time for him to vacate now, step back and let somebody else take the position and grow into it in the 2 years until Euro 2028. I think there's definitely logic to that. But then I look at his contribution in this campaign and even the Macedonia match in 96 minutes in Prague, maybe probably too long in terms of we obviously Hallgrimsson didn't feel we had a better option to put on maybe earlier in that game. But I do kind of wonder if he has it in him for another whirl, even if it's another season, even if it doesn't go to Euro 2028. I can't look at his performances in the last in the games since he came back in after the first camp and say that you'd be pushing him out the door. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, you obviously referenced like what I think was Richie Sadlier and Kenny Cunningham were saying about maybe letting kind of someone else kind of come in that position. Like he's, as you said, he's obviously kind of taking like an ambassadorial role at Everton now. Like it would seem very unlikely that he leaves there, given like as you said, he's kind of like part of the fabric of that football club now. He'd be 39, obviously, like by the time Euro 2028 rolls around, and like looking ahead to the next 2 years, arguably kind of 10 plus games with like not as much riding on them as we've had maybe in the last couple of months. I know the Nations League is important and we need to probably prioritize that more than we have. But like the argument could be made that maybe like this is the perfect time to find a successor at right back with so many of those games coming up that maybe aren't as high stakes as what we've seen in the last few months.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fair enough argument. Fair enough argument. In terms of actually who's next and in terms of giving, you know, obviously, forcing that situation where there's a vacancy and someone has to step up to the plate. But at the same time, you can't not weigh up the clearly the massive impact he's had in the squad in the game since he came back. Like I think he's a huge impact on the Irish defense when he plays. In terms of I think he's you know, I think he's hugely important in making sure everybody's mentally tuned in the right place. I think his that competitive spirit or that professionalism he has. I'd hope that like that lads now, likes of Dara O'Shea, maybe Collins are sort of getting to that point where they'll inherit that. I certainly think Dara O'Shea is taking a big step, as being that sort of bit of a to use Hallgrimsson's favorite word, bit of a bastard in the back line to sort of just get the team going. And maybe it is time, but I don't think if he steps away now, you can't say that he doesn't take a huge amount away with him that we haven't necessarily always had that sort of intangible leadership, presence around the camp.
Yeah, I think Nathan Collins spoke about kind of the impact that him and John Egan had coming into the camp and just kind of their general leadership skills in helping us kind of get over the line in the last couple of games. Another good point I thought you made in the article is that Seamus has like kind of reached the highest level with like little help from like this academy structures that he came through, or like he wasn't someone who was tipped maybe from early on to go on to good things. Like he's probably like kind of an exception to the flawed system which he's came through in that sense.
Yeah, it just thought it was interesting when it was looking back over it. Like if we're kind of like maybe we're being optimistic, but maybe we're hoping that things are going in the right direction and how we're producing players. Like we're looking at players now moving, you know, seven-figure fees for Irish academy produced players, and there seems to be a general sense that we might be getting the act together a bit more, or at least there's a prominent discussion about it, as we know, with the academy funding from the government finally getting over the line and the start of something there. And maybe maybe the team are maybe going in the right direction, but like we do have to admit, we all know this, that we like I think Stephen Kenny called it like a lost generation, like you know, uh, between the sort of before the sort of Evan Ferguson generation, I think the Jeff Hendrick kind of generation, there's like a whole, 10 year sort of spell of youth football there that we just weren't producing for reasons we all know and don't have to go into here in terms of the investment, in terms of how we fell behind. He came up sort of through that time, if you like. I mean, he sort of came through around the same time as some of those guys. But he was, I mean, look at his background. I mean, I know I'm from Donegal myself, like, and you are a long way from the sort of epicenter of Irish kind of schoolboy club football development, which tends to be around the Dublin area traditionally, maybe a little bit around Cork. Um, his background was not that of a carefully honed academy product from, the starlet from the age of 7 or 8, brought into a system and tailored and fine-tuned all the way up. Like he literally played for St. Catherine's, just, it's obviously a junior club in Killybegs. He played GA with Killybegs up until, well into his late teens, got knocked around rough and tumble, obviously honed that competitive spirit. Played for Sligo. If I remember right, he was pretty much on the brink of leaving Sligo. It wasn't happening for him then. And then, obviously change of management there. Paul Cook, he got a run. Willie McStay got eyes on him, former Sligo manager, obviously, and tipped off David Moyes about him. 60 grand later, a legend is born. No, I mean, he's a great, to me, he's a great example of, multi-sport background. Not don't hone them too early. When he came through, if people remember, I remember when he came through. Actually, I think it might have covered his debut for Everton, the notorious Europa League tie when they got beat 5-0 in Portugal, and he was played out of position at left back, and but it was probably the last time that he ever looked, all at sea in terms of like at professional level. And he was raw when he came out. Like he didn't look like an academy footballer. But it was obvious. Like his big sort of breakthrough was later that season. He come on when Everton were 2-0 down against Spurs in a Premier League game. It was a Sunday. It was a live Sky game. And he basically tore up and down the right wing and set up two goals for Everton to draw the match. And that was his kind of like Wayne Rooney remembered the name, kind of moment. And it was clear he was just raw, but he had this like, that aggression, he had that competitiveness. He just had all these things that are really kind of, again, come back to that thing, almost intangible, that obviously been developed through, obviously part of his personality and his makeup. Um, but he just you just tell he made it in the game because of, not because he'd been sort of subject to high quality coaching maybe all the way through, but because he had this just indomitable spirit that kind of forced him up. And I suppose just symbolic of a time when we weren't producing footballers through any kind of real, you know, developed academy structure in Ireland. He was one who almost just pushed himself up through that will, that sort of innate qualities that he had.
Yeah, and I think the context of him like coming into Everton as well, like it's not like like you look at Mason Melia now, obviously, starting for Pats, then going to Tottenham. He's obviously linked up with their under 21s and he's gonna try break through that way. Like Seamus Coleman went straight in from Sligo Rovers first team to Everton first team starting in the Premier League. Like I think that's probably maybe another point that's maybe overlooked in terms of how he came up through the Premier League.
Yeah,
I won't take
he went over. He was just 19, I think, turning 20, and they loaned him out to Blackpool in his first season, and he like it also obviously talk about the fact that his career for all it was a great career, very few medals. One of the medals he won was in the playoff final for Blackpool. Like he just absolutely helped drive Blackpool up into the Premier League. That half a season he had there, Ian Holloway was just heartbroken when he had to send him back to Everton. Like so, that was he sort of that was almost. I mean, what a proving ground that was like for a kid to come straight into a battle for a championship, championship playoff battle, and he never looked back after that.
Yeah, definitely. I won't keep you too much longer, Tom. I just kind of wanted to just ask you a bit about just kind of the broader picture with the national team. Like you've obviously covered like almost all of Heimer's games since he came in. What's your kind of been your thoughts on his tenure today, and maybe how his approach has kind of evolved over the last year?
I think all in all, you have to say he's done a good job. Um, I think he's ticked the boxes in terms of if you looked at the last campaign, like he was a slow burner. I think we're all a bit found it a bit odd his start coming in and maybe taking a back seat and letting sort of John O'Shea and Paddy McCarthy drive things in those opening few windows. We kind of worried, was this guy just on here for a gig and pick up a pay packet, a sort of international management journeyman? Maybe in the end there was a bit of wisdom in that. What he has shown is like I think he's been a really good figurehead for the national team and through really difficult times. If you think of the time he's been in, there's been chief executives and head directors of football and the FAI coming and going. There's been Oireachtas hearings. There's been different issues, scandals, and employment law cases going involving FAI. There's been redundancies, etc. And he's been this really, really good presence to lead the management team because he speaks and he speaks sense. He's a he seems like a good bloke. People like him. He had a couple of run-ins with Stephen Bradley and Damien Duff and things like that. Managed to sort of smooth them over. He just seems like exactly what maybe the team needed, and calmed everything down around the team. And then when you get into the campaign, obviously, look, the first two games, it was a disaster, and he was gone really. Like and like for all the nice things you say about him, you know, it looked like he wasn't cutting the mustard. I think he was. I think, funny enough, the week before the Portugal game that we won, I think like Damien Duff did an interview in the Irish Independent, and it was asked the question, if would you work with the FAI again if the job, and he sort of intimated that he was open to it. I don't know whether that was, you know, timed because everybody expected to be a vacancy, but I think the general feeling was that was that. Thanks, Heimer, but we need to move on. And then it just turned around, and it turned around because he was humble enough to look at the mistakes he'd made in terms of the way the team was set up. He was humble enough to bring Coleman back for one thing, um, which was, as I said, was a huge change. And he was smart enough to look at what our strengths were and say, look, keep it simple, stupid, like in terms of let's set ourselves up to be hard to beat. Um, let's stay in games. Even the point the Armenia game at home, and everybody was going, this is absolute turgid stuff. Like we should be running all over these. But he clearly said, look, this is going to be our identity for the rest of this campaign, and we'll see how far it took us. Now, it probably when it came to Prague, maybe you saw some of the limits there. I think we probably were a few players down that we could have done with a few of those, those couple of players that were injured. The squad depth just wasn't there. I think he turned around and looked at the bench, and maybe there was a few bodies left on. Like Benny had to do a hell of a shift. Coleman had to do a hell of a shift. We really missed Josh Cullen, albeit I mean, look, he's not Perlo, but he's probably he's the best we have in terms of being a presence in midfield. Like we just couldn't as the second half in Prague wore on, we just couldn't get a hold in the game. We got fell deeper and deeper, and we nearly got away with it, but we didn't. And I think that'll go down. Like people will debate about the mat, like, but when you lose games like that, or go out in games like that, you can always pick over everything the manager's done, and that's the nature of the job because we're all Monday morning quarterbacks, you know. Um, he nearly pulled it off. But I think while we all look at that night with such huge regrets, and we feel like looking at what transpired, we could have been there at the World Cup. Broadly looking at the manager's job over the piece, I don't think you can say he hasn't progressed the team and done a good job and taken us to a place where we're mostly pretty positive about things.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair enough to be honest. I think there obviously has been some kind of outward criticism toward Heimer, but like I think as time goes on, we might kind of tend to look at the last couple of months a bit more positively and what it's done to unite the country and stuff. Obviously Prague still stings, but I think overall, it's been positive the last couple of months definitely for Irish football. I won't keep any longer, Tommy. Thanks very much for joining me. And yeah, just thanks very much.
Thank you, James. Best of luck.